So, continuing on, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. In the years that followed Columbus's discovery of the New World, three things happened. One, death. Massive numbers of Indians died from the disease, leaving entire towns and regions deserted for the taking by the Europeans. They saw this as divine provision. God had given them these empty houses with their full fields, and this was seen as support for manifest destiny in the 19th century. If God hadn't meant for the Europeans to come and live here, why did he provide these villages that were completely empty? Not realizing that the Europeans landed 5 years after, the Pilgrims landed 5 years after a French ship docked at the same place. And in those 5 years, more and more people died each year. And the people in the village said, "Whoa, this place is cursed. We got to get out of here," and just ran away, leaving their homes, leaving their fields. And so the pilgrims arrive and they see it sort of ready for them, ready for move in. Number two was war. Indians who did not die were faced with old world weapons that various armies had been developing for centuries. Remember those castles uh, distributed around the countryside in the demise of the Roman Empire. Um, the castles would build bigger walls, and then their neighbors would build bigger cannons to blast through those walls. And so the castles would make even thicker walls, and so the neighbors would make even bigger cannons, back and forth, taking the fireworks from China and developing them into very, very effective machinery for death. These guns were decisive in battles against the Indians, leading Europeans to see divine support for colonialism. And third, inflation. So death, war, and inflation. Third, death and war in the Americas, inflation back in Europe. While the supply of precious metals in Europe and Mediterranean had been mostly static for centuries, suddenly the Spanish had tons and tons of new gold and silver that they could spend on weapons. The problem was to transfer the precious metal safely to Europe, which demanded naval dominance. The English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is thus important because it established the English as a major player in the New World by virtue of its navy. So basically, the let's see, the Spanish are hanging out in South America. Put Colombia on there. And that's where they have all of this silver out of the mines of Bolivia, and they are trying to get it across to Spain. And because when it's in South America, it's basically worthless. I mean, you can buy stuff with it, but stuff is really, really expensive. Once they get it to Spain, then they can spend it on ordinary stuff that is available in Spain, and it's actually effective to buy things. So the Spanish are trying to make these wars, and they say, "Hey, we're going to get $1 billion from South America. We'll get $1 billion this year. We'll get that $1 billion worth of silver and buy an army." The Turkish are like, "Ha, we have hundreds of billions, so we're going to go spend $1 billion, buy an army, and blast you guys to pieces." So the Spanish get 5 billion more. They're like, "Ah, we're going to go spend 5 billion on an army." The Turks are like, "Oh yeah, we'll go spend another billion on an army." Oops, the price is now 5 billion. Whoa, that's getting very expensive. And so every time the Spaniards get more silver, that just drives the prices up, and they outcompete their enemies, back and forth, back and forth, and all along the way, of course, the French and the Dutch and the English are raiding them all the way along there. Those Spanish galleons filled with silver, and instead of them ending up in Madrid, they end up in London and Paris and Amsterdam. So it's all good, all's fair in love and war, piracy, etc. They're only pirates because they're working for the other guys. If they're working for you, then they are the good guys. The new gold and silver supply made Spain the richest country in Europe in the 1600s and 1700s and funded many wars against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, remaining the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean at the time. It also drove major investments all over Europe as the plunder of Spain was shared across the region inflating the European economy with regard to the rest of the world and driving down the value of others, particularly Ottoman investments in precious metals. There's still incredibly steep differences between Britain and Spain and Portugal during this time. In the 1600s, there was a Portuguese ship that had been coming. The Portuguese, the Spanish are over here in South America. The Portuguese are all the way around here in the Indian Ocean getting the spice. So they brought a shipment of spice back, and they were getting it to Portugal, and the British got it and diverted it to the UK, and the value of that single shipment was like the value of the entire economy of Britain at the time. They were so wretchedly, miserably poor, even in the 1600s, compared to the rest of the world. Colonialism is political conquest of one society by another, followed by social domination and forced cultural change. The colonialism that we're talking about, the global colonialism that began in the 1450s and ended in 1945, 1980, has to do with Europeans doing this colonialism to the rest of the world. Land was appropriated for mining or cash cropping, ignoring subsistence needs and collective ownership. Economic development emphasized extraction. So Christopher Columbus actually cut his teeth doing. He's from Italy, of course. He's not Spanish at all. But the Portuguese were the ones doing the sailing at first. They're the sailing nation. Spain is a country, sort of inland nation. But the Spaniards are on the coast, and they're going around the coast of Africa. And Columbus was in I don't know, one of the Cape Coast Castle, I think, in the 1400s. So you can see these countries here. There's Guinea with a coastline, and then this huge interior. There's Ghana with a coastline here, 350 miles plus a huge interior. There's Togo, long skinny country. Benin, long skinny country. This is Gambia is a long skinny country with a little coastline. This is today, when you're 5 years old and you go to school, what language do you learn from the teacher? French, English, Portuguese, French, English, English, French, English, French, but until 1918 it was German. French, English, French, but until 1918 German, etc. French, French, but Belgian French, Portuguese. So you can see here these countries were all colonies of European countries, and the whole point is to have a coastline here. Oh, goodness. Okay. So you have this coastline, and that gets you access to the interior. Of course, all the European countries were along in here. The Danes were in here, the Swedes were in here, the Dutch were in here, etc. This just ended up in England's hands after the 1880s. This ended up in Germany's hands after the 1880s. This ended up in France's hands. So the point of this port here is that you have access to their stuff all in here. There's ivory, there's slaves prior to 1807. There is cattle, there's gold, there's all kinds of silver and salt and all kinds of wood and lumber, all kinds of things that you can get out of here. And if they come out through this one, they go to Berlin. And if they come out of this one, they go to Paris. And if they come out of this port here, they go to London. Okay, so that's the whole point. That's why we have these extractive economies. They are extracting the resources out of the hinterland and shoving it through that port. Takoradi was the colonial port. Shoving it out of that port and going to Paris, to Paris and not to Berlin. It's all about maintaining control over the over what comes out of the country. So we call that an extractive economy. Cortez defeats the Aztec Empire in Mexico in 1521. Pizarro defeats the Inca Empire in Peru in 1533. By 1592, Spain is one of the most powerful countries in the Mediterranean. We have conquistadors in Spain These are Spanish, in South America, these are Spanish military leaders. When they are successful, they are given haciendas, agricultural manors in Spain and Spanish and Portuguese Latin America. And these come with encomiendas, which is the right of conquistadors to the labor of the Indians living in their haciendas. This is slavery. This is the precise thing that was going on in Rome. Back up here, we're scrolling back to Rome. Remember the manorial lords given to the Roman political and military leaders 1,000 years before. These are supposedly people who have been through the Renaissance in the 1500s. What are they doing with the same economy of 1,000 years before, 1,200, 1,500 years before? It's ridiculous. It's insane. These people should be much smarter than this by this time, and they're still making the same errors that the Romans made 1,000 years before. It's just ridiculous that we see this as some kind of great leap forward, and it's actually just completely reversion back to the same old brutality of the Roman Empire.